Hello children, welcome to the next class of biology. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic of the lesson, reproduction, and that is sexual reproduction in plants. And until now we have discussed about the different modes of reproduction of plants and animals than sexual reproduction. Am I right? Yes, there we have discussed about, sexual modes of reproduction, vegetative modes of reproduction, including, the artificial and the tissue culture. Am I right? Yes. And now we are moving to another topic of the lesson, reproduction, and that is sexual reproduction in plants. And you know that in angiosperms, they are the most advanced type of plants. Am I right? Yes. In angiosperms, the most important part of the plant and which helps in the process of sexual reproduction, and that is flower. Yes? Yeah. Either you might have seen flower as separate, individual ones, or as bunches. And if it is as bunches, we call them as inflorescence. And all this you might have seen and heard about that. Today, let's see the details of the flower and its parts. Okay? In case of most of the flowers, you might have seen that it is being attached to the main stem by means of a stalk. Am I right? Yes. And the stalk of the flower, it's called pedicel. See, this is the pedicel. Pedicel is a stalk of the flower, and the flowers with pedicel, we have to call them as pedicellate flower. If they don't have the pedicel, we have to call them as sessile flowers. In some cases, you could see the pedicel is just represented, and such kind of flowers are called subsessile flowers. There you can see the pedicel is a rudimentary structure. So don't forget, the pedicel is the stalk of the flower. Now coming to the basal region of the flower where the pedicel starts, you could see the presence of a leaf-like structure which is one or more than that in number, and that leaf-like structure and which is just represented in the form of a scaly structure, and we have to call it as bract of the flower. Then coming to the other details of the flower, and in case of most of the flowers, you could see there are four whorls. The outer, the green colored one. And you know that it is made up of sepals. See, this is the sepal. Like that, a whirl of sepal you could see around the bud of the flower, or in case of the the fully bloomed flowers, also you could see a green part and the sepal which forms a whirl, and that is called the calyx. Then the most attractive part of the flower, the colorful part, the brightly colored part of the flower, we call them as petals. Petals together forms corolla. Okay. Now, the very important part of the flower is the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part. The female reproductive part of the flower is pistil, and the male reproductive part, they are stamens. We will be discussing all this in detail. Before that, you have to know that all these whorls are arranged on the flower in a particular part, and that part from where all these four whorls, that means the sepals, petals, the male and the female reproductive parts, they arise, and that part of the flower, and which is called as thalamus, it's a part of the flower on which all other floral whorls are attached. And thalamus is also called as torus or receptacle. Then in some flowers you could see around sepals, neither whorl, neither, the green leaf-like scaly structures. We call them as bracteole. Bracteoles are smaller bract. And in case of hibiscus, shoe flower, you could see the presence of a whorl of bracteole, and that is called epicalyx. Okay? So I told you these are the most important parts of the flower. And majorly four main parts you could say: sepal, petal, the female reproductive part and the male reproductive part. This all we are going to study in detail. And before that, in some flowers you should know that there will not be any differences, like sepal, petal differences may not be there, and they are only one whorl, colorless or maybe colored also, and that single whorl without getting differentiated into petal and sepal, if it is present, and we have to call it as perianth. In case of flowers of grasses and all, you could not see sepal and petal, and it's just represented in the form of an undifferentiated structure. We have to call it as perianth. And the individual members of the perianth, it's called tepal. The perianth is also called as perigonium. In case of monocots especially, you could not see the presence of sepals and petals as separate structures, but it gets undifferentiated as perianth or perigonium, as single whorl you can see, especially in grass members. Okay, this is the stalk of the flower. The stalk of the flower is called as, yes, it's being called as pedicel. And this is a picture, real picture of a shoe flower. See, this is a pedicel. And you should know that bract is present at the base of the pedicel. Then bracteoles are mostly present in case of flowers. In shoe flower, you could see bracteoles are arranged in the form of a whorl, and that is called epicalyx. See, this is the epicalyx. And in majority of flowers, four whorls are present. And they are calyx, which is made up of sepal. Each one is called sepal. And together sepals forms calyx. And then inner to the sepal, you could see the petals are arranged, and the whorl of petals forms corolla. Then inner to the corolla, the male reproductive parts and the female reproductive parts are arranged. See, the male reproductive organ consists of, numerous stamens. See, these are the stamens. And each stamen has an anther and a filament. The female reproductive parts, it is made up of, ovary, style, and stigma, which forms the pistil. So you should know that in case of complete flower, all the four whorls are present, especially the male and the female reproductive parts. Such kind of flower is called as perfect flower. If any one part, either the male or the female reproductive part, is absent, we should not call them as complete flower. They are being called as imperfect flower. Okay. Now, this is the receptacle. It's a region of the flower from which all the four whorls are being arranged. Okay. Now, let's see each whorl in detail. First, I told you calyx. Calyx is the outermost whorl of most of the flowers, which is made up of numerous sepals. Sepals are arranged as a whorl, and that forms a calyx. Calyx is green colored part of the flower. And the main function of the calyx is to protect the flower while the flower is in bud stage. Normally, calyx, it falls off as soon as the fruit is formed. But in some cases, especially in brinjal and all, you could see the presence of calyx even after the fruit is formed. Okay, so the outermost whorl of the flower, it's called calyx. Calyx is made up of leafy green-like structures called sepal. Each one is called as sepal. Protection of the flower bud is the main function of the calyx. The next whorl of the flower, that is called corolla. And in case of complete flower, just inner to the calyx, you could see beautifully colored, brilliantly colored petals are arranged. The numerous petals are arranged in the form of a whorl, and that is called corolla. As you know, it's brilliantly colored. The main function of the corolla is to attract insects for pollination. So you should know that corolla is made up of numerous petals. Now coming to the male reproductive part of the flower. I told you the male reproductive part of the flower is made up of numerous stamens. And there is a term for the male reproductive part of the flower, and that is androecium. Androecium is the male part of the flower. And androecium consists of numerous stamens. Each stamen has an anther and a filament. Filament is just hold the anther on position. Anther has two anther lobes and which has pollen sacs inside. Inside the pollen sacs, numerous pollen grains are present. And you know, pollen grains are the male reproductive cells of the plant. So you should know that androecium is a male reproductive part of the flower, which is made up of numerous stamen. Each stamen has an anther and a filament. Inside the anther, pollen sacs are present and where pollen grains are seen. Okay. The female reproductive part of the flower, and that is called gynoecium. Gynoecium is also called as pistil. The pistil consists of carpels and the number of carpels that may vary from flower to flower. Each carpel has three parts: a basal, bulged ovary with ovules inside, then a style, and the receptive stigma. So these three parts together forms the carpel, and that is a part of the female reproductive organ and which is placed at the center of the flower. I told you here in case of ovary, numerous ovules are present. And in each ovule, you could see the presence of the female sex cell, that is egg. So after the process of fertilization, the ovules are being converted into seeds and the ovary is getting transformed into fruit. And you know, the stigma, that is a receptive region which receives pollen grains during the time of pollination. Later, the pollen grains germinates through the style and the pollen cells get fertilized with the egg of the ovules. So, hope the structure of the gynoecium is clear for you. The female reproductive part of the flower, and that is called gynoecium or pistil, and it has carpels. Each carpel has three parts: ovary, style, stigma. Ovary has numerous ovules. Stigma is a receptive region which receives pollen grains and pollen grains germinates through the style. And you know, the ovules are being converted into the seeds after the process of fertilization and ovary gets transformed into the fruit. Okay. So there are four main parts in case of a perfect flower, and they are calyx, which is made up of sepals. The next one is corolla. Those are made up of petals. The male reproductive part is called androecium. and the female reproductive part, which is called gynecium. Thank you.